What difference does it make to be a Christian in the middle of coronavirus? How does the Christian faith affect the way that we view this situation? That's the question I want to think about. And I guess it might be helpful to start by thinking about a situation where Jesus himself encountered death and disease. You may remember in John's Gospel, chapter 11, John tells us about a time when Jesus had a really good friend called Lazarus, who was ill. And Lazarus' sisters, Mary and Martha, sent a message to Jesus to say, look, he's ill, you've got to come quickly. Now Jesus delayed, it seems deliberately, for 2 days where he was before he went to Lazarus, which meant that by the time he got there, Lazarus had already died. Now Mary and Martha, his sisters, independently both greet Jesus with these words, Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. Where were you? You didn't show up. If you'd been here, things would be different. And I guess that may be how we feel about God in the face of coronavirus. Where is he? He hasn't showed up. Is he self-isolating? What's going on? Well, how does the Christian faith hold up in the face of this? I want to suggest three distinctives about the way we'll view coronavirus as Christians. And the first is that the Christian won't be surprised by what's happening. There'll be an element of realism for us. So it's fair to say that Christians may be sad, we may be angry, we may struggle to understand what's going on, but we won't despair, we won't be thrown, it won't throw our faith. It's interesting, as Jesus meets Mary and Martha, he goes to Lazarus' tomb, and it seems he knows full well what he's about to do. He's about to raise Lazarus from the dead. And yet as he looks around and he sees Mary and Martha and everybody weeping for Lazarus, we're told that Jesus himself wept. Famously the shortest verse in the Bible, Jesus wept. Why is he weeping? Well, it's not for Lazarus because he knows he's about to raise him from the dead. He's weeping out of a sense of indignation as he sees around him the sorrow and the sadness caused by death and disease. At one level that shows us God's not indifferent to what's going on. But more than that, Jesus weeping has a sense that this is not how it is supposed to be. Christians have believed through the ages that God created the world good, that it was perfect, but that it was then spoiled by evil, particularly the sin of humanity, the fact that humans love to live their own way rather than serving God meant that sin came into the world, and as a result, everything's been kind of spoiled, kind of ruined. In Romans chapter 8, the language Paul uses is that of creation being frustrated, longing for a day when it'll be set free from the disease and decay that spoils it. It's a bit like walking around, I don't know, an ancient ruined city. I remember years ago I went with my wife to Salamis in North Cyprus, a stunning place to go. There was hardly anyone there, and you could see all the columns of the old city. And in one glance you could see both the wonder of that place as it had been, but at the same time it was ruined. I think it's the way we often feel about our world. We see on one hand the majesty of it, and yet also the brokenness. It's a beautiful world, and yet it is marked by death and disease and decay. Now I just want to pause for a moment, because it may be that we're saying, look, this is all very old hat, isn't it? No one believes in God anymore, no one believes in evil. But just as the Christian has to ask how our worldview is holding up in the midst of what's going on, the atheist has to ask the same question. Is their worldview holding up? So let me quote to you from Richard Dawkins, famous atheist. He says, in a universe of electrons and selfish genes, blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt, other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason to it, nor any justice. He says there's no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. Except that the one thing you won't find in an atheist is blind, pitiless indifference. I mean, this disease is kind of good from an evolutionary point of view, isn't it? Isn't it just part of the brutal reality of the world? It's a disease that picks off the old and the weak. Should we not be indifferent to it if this is just a random universe with no God? But I think none of us can just shrug it off like that. Jesus certainly couldn't. If we're going to be angry at evil, well, where does evil come from? I can't get angry at something that doesn't exist. Now, I suspect that most of us don't have the sort of atheism that Richard Dawkins has. I suspect many people in our culture believe more in the sort of sense of progress. So as John Gray puts it, he says, the progress of humanity has replaced belief in divine providence. So back in Greek and Roman and Eastern thought, people viewed history as really a circle that would go round in circles. And it was a Christian idea to view history as having a sense of purpose, creation groaning and moving towards that day when it would be redeemed, when we would move into a new heaven and a new earth. And I think often what people want to do today is keep that sense of progress, but without God. So I think the idea is that as we grow in knowledge, as we improve in technology, we'll move into a more advanced society in terms of our morality, in terms of our thinking, in terms of our control of the world. You know, we're the society that put man on the moon. When I was a kid, smoked salmon was kind of a treat at Christmas. Now you just pick it up in a sandwich at Pret anytime you like. But coronavirus kind of puts a block on that whole story of progress. I mean, I kind of used to think of plagues as being something that happened in the medieval times that wouldn't happen to us anymore. And now suddenly, with all our knowledge and sophistication, everything seems to have stopped. What happened to progress? That's not just coronavirus, is it? I mean, look at, I don't know, the internet, the ultimate combination of knowledge and technology. What do we do with it? Well, sure, some good things, but many bad things as well. I mean, basically, the internet seems to have revitalized human trafficking. The slave trade has come back to life. Hardly feels like progress. The rockets with which we put a man on the moon are the rockets we use to fire nuclear warheads. In other words, if there is no God, why do we think it's coherent to believe in some kind of notion of progress? So the question we have to ask is our faith working? And I think for the Christian, well, we won't be surprised by what is happening in the midst of all this. There'll be a sense of realism, both in terms of the events and also in terms of how people react to them. So back in Romans 8, Paul says creation is longing to be redeemed, but he also says that people are as well. That actually evil is not just something out there in the world, but that actually it's within my own heart. I guess some of us might have experienced that in lockdown. We'll find within ourselves anger and frustration that we lash out at those we love in a way that's just kind of uncomfortable. If you go to Bath, to the Royal Spas there, all the water tastes slightly of sulphur because it bubbles through minerals on its way out, and the minerals just leave that flavour, that taste in all the water. Well, so it is that in our world, sin, our selfishness just leaves a taste on everything. And so we need to be redeemed as people. One of the things people like to talk about in this virus is that of solidarity. People like to sort of tell the story that we're really pulling together. And so the idea is that we're all the good guys, we're putting together, we like the NHS. And then there are bad people out there who do panic buying. But I think if we're honest with ourselves, we know it's not that simple. There's things within all of us that we're proud of and things that we're ashamed of. And we'll be realistic when we confront that. We're not going to be surprised by what is happening to our world or what is happening within inside of us. So I think the Christian isn't surprised. They have realism. But secondly, I think the other characteristic of the Christian is we'll have hope in the middle of this. So as Jesus stands at the tomb of Lazarus, he doesn't just offer compassion. He actually does something. He stands there in front of the tomb. He calls out to Lazarus, "Come out." They roll back the stone of the tomb. Everyone's expecting a stench of death, and out he comes. And then Jesus goes from there. He walks into Jerusalem, and he goes to die on the cross. Now, at one level, that shows us that God knows what it is to suffer, that he's alongside us in our suffering. They say that in the Roman plague of AD 165, as all the Roman citizens were fleeing the city, they met Christians coming the other way, coming in to look after the poor. Well, Jesus hasn't fled the suffering of this world. He's come into it. But he's not just come alongside us. He's come to pay the price for our sin, to set us free from sin. That idea of redemption, of creation of us, it's the idea of being set free. Think of a debtor's prison back in the day when someone had a big debt to pay and they'd be locked away. Well, it required someone else to pay that debt, and then they could go free out of some stinking medieval prison that would make lockdown look like a walk in the park, and out into the fresh air, into the bright sky above. Well, so when Jesus died on the cross, he paid the price for our sin. Evil must be punished. He took the punishment, and therefore he set us free. free from the guilt of our sin and free to enter God's great new creation to come, heaven, where everything will be set right. Revelation says that in heaven, God will wipe away every tear from our eyes. Death will be no more. There'll be no mourning or crying or pain. The former things will have passed away. And that's a real physical place. I think we often think of death as being just a sort of vague oblivion. It's what the Greeks and Romans used to think. But the Bible says it's a real, tangible place. There is real hope. Now, again, it may be that at this point we just say, well, hang on a minute. Isn't that just pie in the sky when you die? Isn't this all rather dreamy? But I think two things to say that. One is, look at the resurrection of Jesus. When he promises us eternal life, it's one thing. But then when we then see him die and come back to life, well, suddenly now we have hope that that actually could be true. But more than that, my sort of life today is impacted by my future hope. If I have hope for the future, well, then it'll take away fear and anger today. It'll enable me to, it'll set me free to love, to serve other people. So if I have hope for the future, if I have hope, then in grief, I'll know that death isn't the end. If I have hope, then when I get ill, I know that if I die and face God, I'll do so forgiven. If I have hope of a new creation to come, then when I look around and I see all these shops boarded up and these events cancelled, I'll know that there is more than a recovery coming. There is a whole new world that God has promised to lead us into. This is hope. But let's just think a little bit more about what that means for us today. If the Christian has realism, if we have hope, I think the third characteristic of the Christian in the face of this is that we have a sense of purpose. So I think for many people, this whole lockdown has been very disarming because whatever our plans were for the year, we've had to change them. We've maybe had to find new work. We've had to reinvent ourselves in some way. But for the Christian, our fundamental purpose is to seek the glory of God, and that remains unchanged. It's just the same as it was 6 months ago. You know, if I take a compass, the needle will always point north, and I can turn around 180 degrees, the whole casing changes, and the needle will head back and point north. Well, so for the Christian, our whole world may be turned upside down, but our fundamental purpose will be to seek God's glory. If my view is that the greatest good in this world is my happiness, and that God's job is to provide me with my happiness, then he has undoubtedly let me down. If I think that God has taken a risk with my happiness because he thought the greatest thing was free will, and he's compromised and risked my happiness and slightly let go of things and dropped the ball, then he's let himself down. But if I'm living for God's glory, if I think his glory is the greatest good, then whilst I may not fully understand what's happening at the moment, my sort of fundamental purpose in life remains unchanged. Now, why would I seek his glory? Well, I think the story of the cross shows us that the pattern of the Christian life is one of suffering followed by glory. So as I suffer, I sort of have this sense that there is a future glory to come. It's kind of the story of every life, isn't it? Think of any great hero you can think of. If you take the suffering out of their life, suddenly their life story becomes very bland. Think of Nelson Mandela, The Long Walk to Freedom. Take all the suffering out of his story, what does it become? The short amble to something I had before. It's the story of pretty much every movie, every novel, suffering followed by some kind of redemption. That's the great story that we tell each other. We tell each other stories of redemption. That doesn't really explain why God is allowing this to happen, but it does begin to help me to see that maybe this is a story of redemption that is the great story that God is telling. Think back to Mary and Martha. Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. But then they wouldn't have seen Jesus raise their brother from the dead. They wouldn't have seen the supreme glory. They wouldn't have seen that joy that Jesus then led them into. That doesn't answer all the questions that we have. But it just gives me a sense that actually if I'm pursuing God's glory, well, whilst I may not fully understand what he's doing, maybe he is going to lead me to somewhere all the more wonderful. I at least can trust him. And so my purpose is unchanged. Actually, Romans 8 says that my purpose is to become more like the Lord Jesus. When I look at him, I see someone of compassion. I see someone of love. I see someone of power. To become more like him is a wonderful gift. I guess one of the questions this puts to us all is what is it that we're living for? What is our purpose? For cold rationality, for some kind of naive belief in progress, for our own ambitions, our plans to please the crowd? Or will we live for the God who didn't stay remote from this world but came into it and suffered and died for us? So that's 3 thoughts on the difference that being a Christian makes in the middle of this. I think the Christian isn't thrown by this. I think the Christian has hope. And I think the Christian has a sense of purpose, heading for a glory that calls us out of ourselves into the redemption of a great new creation to come.